story of the Shenmue series is certainly an interesting and tumultuous tale. In 1983, young programmer Yu Suzuki joined Sega. He quickly worked his way to becoming a director of many popular arcade titles. Hang-On, Space Harrier, Afterburner, and Virtua Fighter were just a few of them. In 1996, Suzuki began work on a 3D RPG for the Sega Saturn under the working title Guppy. Later in production, he began working it into his Virtua Fighter series, and the title was changed to Virtua Fighter RPG Akira's Story. The plot would focus on Virtua Fighter's Akira, who would overcome grief following his father's death, travel to China, defeat an antagonist, and start a new journey with a new friend. Suzuki wanted to create a game with a cinematic approach and elaborate combat sequences. He wanted to have 4 acts with themes of sadness, confrontation, departure, and new beginnings. Suzuki recruited people with stage and film experience to help him create his vision. Years later, the public would see test footage of Virtua Fighter RPG, and it was incredibly impressive. The Saturn was notorious for being difficult to program for, and for its limited 3D capabilities. So for a game to look like this, it's just amazing. Because of how unique his new game was becoming, Suzuki decided to drop the Virtua Fighter connection, and his project was then retitled Shenmue. Development for Shenmue was moved over to the Sega Dreamcast, possibly because of the Saturn's commercial failure outside of Japan, or to take advantage of more powerful hardware. Word of Suzuki's project was leaked to the public in 1998 when Sega of America Vice President Bernie Stolar told video game magazine Next Generation,
"I can't tell you what Mr. Suzuki is working on. Let's just say that I've seen the project and it's going to rock the gaming world."
It was clear to anyone that Suzuki had ambitious goals for the game. He later said he wanted to have a story with 11 chapters spanning across at least 5 games. These ambitions came with a price though. Because of the amount of content that Suzuki wanted and the scrapped Saturn version of the game, Shenmue was at one point the most expensive video game ever made, with an estimated budget of $70 million. Shenmue was formally revealed at the Yokohama International Assembly Hall. To help explain the game to the public, Sega released a promotional disc called What's Shenmue in August of 1999. In it, you would play as Ryo looking for Sega president Hidekazu Yukawa. It was a short little demo that showcased the basic gist of the game with a tongue-in-cheek approach. The game launched in Japan on December 29, 1999. It would see a US release in November 2000, followed by a European release the next month. Shenmue tells the tale of 18-year-old Ryo Hazuki. Ryo is the son of a martial arts teacher, Iwao Hazuki. Ryo comes home one day to find his father being beaten by a Chinese man named Lan Di. Lan Di demands Iwao hand over something called the Dragon Mirror. Iwao refuses at first, but when Lan Di threatens to kill Ryo, he gives in to his demands. Lan Di then accuses Iwao of murdering a man named Sun Ming Zhao and kills Iwao in front of Ryo before escaping with the Dragon Mirror. Afterwards, Ryo swears to get revenge for his father's death and begins looking for clues to Lan Di's whereabouts. Now that I've covered the history of the development and the basic premise, you may be asking, what kind of game is Shenmue? Honestly, it's kind of hard to describe it. It's kind of an open world game, but it's also kind of a life simulator, and it's kind of a fighting game, and it's kind of a detective game. It's kind of a lot of things. It had a lot of ambitious and impressive qualities, the most obvious of which are the graphics. Shenmue came out in 1999, a year after Ocarina of Time, but when you look at them side by side, it's almost as if Shenmue came out 5 years later. It was that much better. Speaking of Zelda, Shenmue introduced an in-game clock and NPCs with daily routines before Majora's Mask. It had dynamic weather, it had full voice acting, and it was bursting with life. You could interact with damn near any object in the game. On a technical level, it was astounding for its time. It soon garnered a dedicated and obsessive fan base that praised it for its realistic and detailed environments and how the gameplay and the story worked together. However, it also had its detractors that criticized it for its slow pace, awkward presentation, and its mundane gameplay. I fall somewhere in the middle, but a little bit more on the positive side. I can safely say that I legitimately enjoyed the first Shenmue game. The story was engaging, I thought the combat was fun, the characters were amusing, and it really made you feel like you were in 1986 Japan. Plus the gameplay varied enough that I never really got bored. Sure, it was a series of elongated fetch quests, but the way they worked the quest into the story felt natural, especially when you understand Japanese culture. It was all about getting to know the people in the town, looking for clues and tracking down leads. It may not be exciting, but it blended that cinematic realism with gameplay much better than I think most modern games do. Plus, I really dug the music. It was catchy and easy to listen to. There were things I disliked though, mainly the controls. Moving with the D-pad and running with the trigger really hurt my hand on the Dreamcast controller. I seriously had a sore index finger and a red thumb after marathoning it. Controlling Ryo outdoors is okay, but controlling him indoors is just cumbersome and irritating. The voice acting is very unnatural, but this is largely because of how literally they translated the original Japanese dialogue. There are many conversational phrases in Japanese that don't sound right in English. This is most evident by the amount of times that Ryo says, "I see." In North America, we only had the English dub, so the voice acting was just something we had to deal with. There were some other quirks that I just had to get used to, like when Ryo had to take the bus to go to the docks. You literally have to go to the bus stop and wait for the bus. And if a certain plot point would happen at 7 p.m., but it was only 3 p.m., you'd have to find something to do for 4 hours. I didn't mind these, but I can see why people didn't like them. I would sometimes pick up side quests or kill time at the arcade. The arcade in this game is actually pretty fun and has real Sega titles to play like Hang On and Space Harrier. One thing Shenmue was known for was its use of QuickTime events in cutscenes, which was very divisive. Even at the initial reveal, gamers complained about them. I totally get the distaste for QuickTime, especially with how it's used nowadays. However, I thought it was a good way to keep the players invested in the story because you never knew when these would pop up. And they really were quick, so they would put players on edge at moments when Ryo himself was on edge. Little touches like that I really enjoyed because I thought it was a good blend of story and interactivity. So yeah, I liked the first game. It was an oddity that drew me in with its charm. It hasn't aged as well as some other games, but for what it is, I thought it was a unique experience. I give it an 8 out of 10. Unfortunately, despite relatively positive reviews, Shenmue's sales failed to recoup its development costs and it was considered a commercial failure. Despite this, Suzuki and Sega pressed on to create the next installment. They figured the next game could be completed for a much more reasonable sum because they now knew exactly what direction they were going in. Shenmue II was released in Japan and Europe in the fall of 2001 on the Dreamcast. The North American market would never see a Dreamcast release of Shenmue II because of the system's discontinuation. A year later, North America would see a port of Shenmue II on the new Microsoft Xbox in October of 2002. This version of Shenmue 2 came with a DVD cut of the first Shenmue game to catch newcomers up to the story. Shenmue 2 is more or less the same as the first game, but with some improvements. This time around the game takes place in Hong Kong rather than Japan. The new world is much larger and the story this time around included a lot of new interesting side characters, notably Ren and Joy. It also introduced a new time skip feature to avoid some of the waiting around that the first game suffered from. NPCs could now lead Ryo to certain landmarks and you now have a mini-map in the corner. You can also transfer save data from Shenmue 1 to Shenmue 2. This means Ryo's stats and inventory will be right where you left them at the end of the first game. Unfortunately, the Xbox version lost this feature. One thing I noticed about Shenmue 2 is how phenomenal some of the cutscene direction is. It really felt like a cinematic gaming experience. I loved a lot of these moments. Other than that, it's pretty much the same as the first game, right down to the terrible controls. Some may see this game as being too similar to the first one, while others may enjoy the consistency given the nature of how the series was envisioned. I can understand both sides. Personally, I enjoy this one a bit more because I think it does have a more epic feel than the first game. Shenmue 2 also gets an 8 out of 10. At the end of Shenmue 2, Ryo meets a young girl named Shenhua. He learns that she has a connection to the Phoenix Mirror and she offers to introduce him to her father. They soon discover that he is missing and go looking for him. They find a note and a sword inside of a cave and they use the Phoenix Mirror to trigger a device that causes the mirror to shoot out an energy beam. This makes the sword float and reveals a giant mural of the dragon and Phoenix Mirror. This was a holy shit moment. The series had been so grounded in reality that it was a big deal when these supernatural elements were introduced. Where could the series go from here? Unfortunately, fans would not get the answer to these questions for 18 years. Just like the first game, Shenmue II was a commercial failure. The Japanese and PAL version launched on a dead console, while the North American version came out on a console that had no fanbase yet. At this point, Sega had abandoned console manufacturing, so there was no need for them to push for another expensive failure, and this series was left behind. Yu Suzuki would continue to work on minor projects for Sega before leaving the company in 2011. He later founded his own studio, YesNet. He made it clear that he had not forgotten his passion project by releasing a mobile game in Japan called Shenmue City, and he had even planned to create a Shenmue Online game before abandoning that project. It seemed that the next true installment in the Shenmue series would never come, but that all changed at E3 2015 during Sony's press conference. The company just caused a massive uproar of cheers when they revealed a full remake of Final Fantasy VII, and almost immediately after that trailer came, fan reaction was extreme. This was easily one of the best conferences in E3 history. These back-to-back reveals took everyone by surprise, largely because people had just given up hope of either of these games becoming a reality. Yu Suzuki came out on stage and laid out exactly how Shenmue III was going to happen. Sega themselves would have nothing to do with the game other than allowing Suzuki to use the Shenmue license. Sony had agreed to pay for the advertising in exchange for console exclusivity. The actual funding for development was to come from fans via Kickstarter. The initial goal for Shenmue III's budget was set for $2 million. It met its goal within 8 hours of being announced. It was the highest funded Kickstarter game ever. Its development budget ended up being $7.1 million. Further funding would come from Deep Silver, who would take over publication. Shenmue III was delayed several times, and the Steam port would end up being delayed an additional year due to a deal made with Epic Games. In the meantime, the original two Shenmue games received HD ports to the PS4 and the Xbox One in 2018. It was clear to everyone that Shenmue was back, and after years of anticipation, Shenmue III finally came out on November 19th, 2019. Shenmue III picks up immediately after Shenmue 2, with Ryo and Shenhua in the cave. Once they leave, they decide they need to find out what happened to Shenhua's father and what her connection is to the mirrors. The first part of Shenmue 3 takes place in Bailu Village, while the second part takes place in the city of Niawu. Gameplay-wise, Shenmue 3 is very similar to the first two games in a very antiquated way. Almost all of the side activities feel like they were made for the Dreamcast. It's as if the game was frozen in time until this very moment, and I really liked that. This antiquated feeling extends to the voice acting. The English dub is once again very awkward and stilted. Thankfully, they have the option for the English or Japanese voice acting, so I went with the Japanese. However, now that I have a decent grasp of the language, I noticed that the conversations are awkward even in Japanese. The controls have been updated and you now move with the analog stick, which is a major improvement, though it can be a bit clunky at times too. The menu layout feels just like the originals, and Ryo's notebook has been updated with tabs to make jumping around pages much easier. Later in the game, you can call characters from the previous games to check in with them, and these conversations were surprisingly natural and realistic. The music is on par with the first two games, and while the character models themselves look like early PS3 games, the environments are gorgeous and the colors just pop off the screen. Another fun thing is going to the Save Shenmue building in Niawu, which is a shrine dedicated to Shenmue fans, Kickstarter backers, and just the Shenmue series in general. I thought this was really cool fan service. Combat is pretty much identical to the first two games. The only difference is that there are no more throw moves. I didn't mind this since the only time I ever really used those was to beat Chai in the U Arcade in the first game. Because Sega wasn't involved with this game, there are no Sega titles in the arcades. This was to be expected, and while the arcades in this game are amusing, they aren't as fun as the first two. My favorite thing about Shenmue 3 was all the interactions between Ryo and Shenhua. She is freaking adorable. She always cooks for Ryo, always tells him good morning, tells him good night. She's waifu as fuck. She's super sweet, and I really loved everything about her. Unfortunately, I can't say that I loved this game. I did not enjoy Shenmue III as much as the other two games. I'll list some minor issues before getting to what really annoyed me. Ryo's health drains when he runs, which I was relatively indifferent on at first because you're supposed to train Ryo to increase his health capacity, but Ryo's health drains even when he's standing still. This causes you to have to spend money on food. Sure, it's more realistic, but it equates to a lot of grinding for cash, and the realism is sort of shattered when I'm having Ryo eat 6 entire cloves of garlic just to keep his stinky ass standing. Leveling up Ryo's endurance is done by training, which is fine, but in order to level up his attack damage, you have to buy new moves and just keep mashing them out at the temple until you max them out. And the moves are expensive, so you'll be grinding even more. There are multiple ways to make money, which I liked, but the only one that's quick is selling herbs. You hear that, kids? If you want to get rich quick, then you need to start selling drugs. The QTEs in this game don't come in for a while, but when they do, they are really quick. There's no consequence to messing up, but you're only allowed one screw up. In the original games, you sometimes can make a couple of mistakes, particularly during any of the chase scenes. Not here. One screw up and you just have to try again. While I don't care about graphics, I do care about performance, and Shenmue 3 does not perform very well on the PS4. The game suffers from frame rate lag and atrocious pop-in. There will be many times where Ryo just stops running and then a few seconds later an NPC will just appear in front of him. It was a persistent problem throughout the game. What was also annoying was being unable to skip through conversations. There were times where I would accidentally talk to a person who just appeared in front of me and I couldn't quickly exit the conversation. You can only skip conversations with characters you've already talked to, but it only applies to that day. Also, Ryo's curfew this time around is even earlier than the originals. Ryo automatically goes back to Shenhua at 9 PM. It doesn't matter what you're doing. The originals allowed you to be out till 11:30 PM so you could get more things done. But those are just some things that I mechanically didn't like, but my biggest gripe was actually how the story played out. All the supernatural elements introduced at the end of Shenmue 2 are totally ignored, and the actual progression of the plot was honestly really underwhelming. There's the typical Shenmue running around and talking to people, which is made a little bit more tedious because I can't fast forward through the people who don't have anything to say, but the entirety of Bailu Village in its most basic form is finding a group of bad guys, beating them up, then losing to a big tough guy, then going to get trained by a master who sends me on grindy side quests, then teaches me a move, then fighting the big tough guy again. Then you go to Niaowu and do the exact same thing. Almost beat for beat. It's the same thing. Find a group of bad guys, beat them up, then lose to a big tough guy, then go get trained by a master who sends me on a grindy side quest, and then teaches me a special move, then going off to fight a big tough guy again, and then the game is over. I really didn't like this at all. Say what you will about the first two games, but other than running around and talking to people, I never really felt like I was doing the same thing twice. I felt like what I was doing was natural and lent itself to the story and the world. This honestly feels like padding, in a really bad way because it conflicts with the realism of the story. There are just parts where it doesn't make sense, like when the thugs in Bailu Village take a hostage. Ryo can't beat the big tough guy, so he asks for help and has to prove himself to an old kung fu master. But we've established that there are 3 kung fu masters in this village, so why are none of them helping him save one of their neighbors? If they think Ryo is unprepared, fine, but this is a hostage situation. Now is not the time to worry about Ryo's skill level. Then there's another point where right before the fucking climax of the game, Ryo decides to help this pawn shop guy find a ring, a plate, and a camera. Who gives a shit? You are literally about to confront the main bad guy who also has a hostage, one that we actually know and care about. But Ryo won't go through the damn gate because some random dude asked for a favor. Why is this mandatory right before the fucking climax? Also, those elongated fetch quests that the masters each send you on involve excessive grinding for money, and everyone tells you that you have to go to a fortune teller so you can know what to bet on when you gamble. Again, conflicting with the realism. Another issue I have is that all of the side characters are underdeveloped and honestly not very interesting. They almost feel shoehorned in. And Ryo meeting back up with Ren was weird. They just start talking again like it's not crazy at all that they just met up again in a totally different part of the country. The ending to the game introduces some interesting twists, and Ryo gets to have a brief fight with Lan Di, which was really cool. But the whole game feels really slow and padded, and then just fast forwards to an ending out of nowhere. I'm not mad that the story didn't conclude here. I kind of figured this wouldn't be the end, but I would have preferred if they packed more plot in the game, especially considering how drawn out some parts are. The story being weak is a big detriment to a Shenmue game because that's what made these games work. I liked how the first two mixed their story with their gameplay in a way that felt organic. This was an instance where the story took me out of the game, which was unfortunate, especially when my expectations for the game were honestly pretty modest. From a gameplay perspective, I didn't have many issues with Shenmue III, but from a story perspective, I found it to be the least engaging of the series. Plus the technical problems were a constant annoyance. I really can't say I can recommend the game to any newcomers with its $60 price tag. There are better games that you can get your money's worth from. I personally didn't feel ripped off at all. I got the game for $35 at Best Buy during a Black Friday deal, and it came with the Steelbook. Now, that's a pretty good deal. Right now, the final score for Shenmue 3 is a 6 out of 10. If the game gets a patch to fix the technical problems, drops the price down to $40, and has the square button actually skip through conversations quicker, I could give it a 7. The story progression still holds it back from being as good as the other games. Ironically, after years of waiting for Shenmue 3, we're back to where we started, only this time with Shenmue 4. Do I think Shenmue 4 will happen? No. At least, not physically. In true Shenmue fashion, Shenmue 3 has not been a commercial hit. It came out to little fanfare, and some people were still upset over the Epic Games exclusivity deal. Plus, most of the fans who wanted Shenmue 3 already paid for it when they funded the Kickstarter, so the sales numbers largely come from newcomers, of which there are few. At this point, if Shenmue 4 were to come out, I feel like it would either be a digital game or even an expansion pass to Shenmue 3. Personally, I kind of like the latter because it would pack more story content into a game where I feel it's a bit lacking. Despite having mixed feelings on the third installment, I still like the Shenmue series. They are just unique oddities in the gaming world, and it's hard not to respect Yu Suzuki's dedication to his fanbase and his vision. I admire his determination to finish the series the way that he wants to, with as few compromises as possible. The future of the series is unclear, but for now, the story goes on. That's it for this episode of Ranting Spider-Man. Let me know what you guys thought of Shenmue 3. Did it live up to your expectations, or were you disappointed in ways that I wasn't? Let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Hey guys, if you enjoyed my content, then you should follow me on Twitter, where I post channel updates and information on upcoming videos. You can find the link in the description. Thanks for watching.